Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To some of you and peace out to the rest of you. Black Artist Hun, I'm black and again asking you to hit that share button. Thank you for hitting like or subscribe, but the share button is important because the message is more important than the messenger. I want to give a shout out to Mr. Fantastic and the dark skin panel he had. I haven't even finished listening. I want to give a shout out to the Reverend Brother Pastor Deacon Dr. Edward Anderson. I say that as a compliment, of course, because and I need to hear more of his takes on that. But he was on point about something, and that is that it gets exaggerated. Now, I'm never going to sit up and tell you colorism does not exist. Nobody's ever going to hear me say that. You all know that, but it does get exaggerated. Even by it exists. I confess to that. It also gets exaggerated. So that being said, now that we got that out the way, I'm going to address some historical misconceptions that we have about colorism. And in these misconceptions, I realized that a lot of us just did not necessarily know a lot of what I'm about to tell you. But it's still true, and it's still necessary for us to know and understand these things. So these misconceptions have, we think that they come from history, and there is some history behind them, but the history is not properly understood by us. And this is why I say that black people specifically need to not just talk about history, but read it and share it with each other. Because see, just like I'll tell you in a heartbeat, and I don't apologize for saying this, I tell you that Islam is a solution. I'd also tell you, go look it up for yourself. Many of you say, yeah, but see, Chancellor Williams said, well, see, Chancellor Williams took his history from a specific set of sources, white folk. So many, there are others who looked at the history to double check him, and they said, wait, no, we can't back him up. And they couldn't. It's true. They could not back him up because there were things that were not talked about, such as on some of these tours in East Africa, in Zanzibar. They'll show you certain places and say this was the place used to keep slaves by the Arabs. And it'll turn out that the buildings were actually used by the British to store ammunition. Abdullah Hakim Quick gave an example of this. Well, the same thing is happening now with history in general with us. And one of them is colorism. So I'm going to go ahead and dispel some of these misconceptions starting right now. The misconceptions of colorism go beyond how black people stereotype each other, you see. And I'm not here to condemn the jokes that people crack as strictly jokes between two people who are close to each other or more than two. That's not what I'm here for, because the jokes actually can be funny, very entertaining, as long as they're tolerated in both directions. The problem is that the misconceptions, well, see, they're not jokes, but they become the assumptions behind the jokes. And even though jokes are just jokes, the misconceptions become the reasons for future decisions, just like facts can be. You can make a decision based on facts. You can make it based on misconceptions. If you make a decision based on facts, you're at least acting on accurate information. What happens when you make it just based on misconceptions, though? You're going to correct wrongs that weren't committed. You're going to commit wrongs that were unnecessary. So I can choose to do nice things for someone that actually helped me out. I can choose to do nice things for someone that I thought helped me out, and it was really someone else, and then it becomes accidentally unfair, rewarding the one that didn't do anything. And if I'm lied to enough, I could punish the one that did nothing. One misconception is that being a house slave went hand in hand with being lighter skinned. This was no guarantee during slavery. Working in a house had to do with how much master could trust you and how loyal he thought you were. And a light-skinned slave was not automatically trusted. Now, promoted, I'm going to tell you this. There is a historical pattern they've had of trying to promote lighter-skinned Negroes, but oftentimes we've done that. They have a history of trying to do it if they think that they can sow division this way. But if they meet someone that's not going to play that game and sow division, they abandon that effort right off the bat. This is something I myself have witnessed in recent times. So if a light-skinned slave back then was not trusted, he or she wasn't in the house. That's how it worked. Being related to the master helped, but they often sold their own children away to other owners because the white wives did not want to see mixed children competing with their own white children for dad's affection and attention, and that was actually pretty common. I'm going to tell you a story later on about one escape that was partially, that involved this, an escape story that involved exactly this. Another misconception was that house slaves were loyal. No, house slaves actually were very much under control, and they were also abused more often because they were in close proximity to Massa and his wife. That's the other thing. House slaves were, it was understood a lot of times that house slaves would give supplies to those who were planning to run away. If the two of them knew each other well enough to trust each other, then the house slave would be the one that would sneak some extra chicken. And one of the reasons the chicken was fried was because it would last longer, it keep longer in a fried state. So it could give someone a head start with something to eat. Another misconception is that lighter slaves were automatically more loyal during bondage. That wasn't true either. See, melanin never at any time had anything to do with melanin. Loyalty never had anything to do with melanin. We understand that naturally. There's no link if we think about it logically. But see, children who are mistreated rebel all the time against their parents. It's not reasonable for anyone to believe that even the mixed children of the masters, not just light skin, but the outright mixed children of the masters, were guaranteed to be more loyal when the masters wouldn't treat them well or even equally. It doesn't work like that. So what about those who are light skinned without mixture or relationship to the owner? They don't have an incentive to be more loyal. Many don't know the story of Ellen Craft, and that's a slave woman that could pass for white. She was married to another slave named William. Now, this is that story I'm going to tell you about now. She was thin, so she sewed some men's clothes, passed herself on trains and steamboats as a frail, sickly white man with her right arm in a cast, and her husband was passed off as the personal servant slave, so they could travel without her having to sign anything, and her right arm was in a cast. By the time the wanted posters could be printed, they were already long gone. It took them about 5 days. They were on their way to freedom. And they arrived in Philadelphia on Christmas Day. Then they had to be smuggled to Canada, and from there they went to England, and they made a living there. But neither she nor her husband were loyal, and she was the daughter of her owner. Yeah, her first master was her father, but his wife wanted her gone because she resembled the rest of his family. This was one famous case written in the book, but just as we joke today about how red bones like me go to the hardest on white folks, this phenomena has a reason, and that is that when they drop their guard around you, you see their dirt and their hypocrisy, and you can't respect hypocrites. So they smash misconceptions that we have about them right in front of our faces. We think they have their boo-boo together. Believe me, they don't. Red bones come around and they drop their guard. Then you say they don't have this stuff together. They just prioritize staying on top of everybody else and keeping us at the bottom and keeping all of the non-white, non-black people somewhere in between. Another misconception is that light-skinned black families want to remain light-skinned. Now, this was partially true in the past. But actually, I say partially because, see, in real life, lighter-skinned families were divided on that issue from the very beginning. And mine was only one example. That's the reason that my family is not only light-skinned. Many families today that were light-skinned in the past, of course, they're now both. And even on the Gulf Coast, from which I come, many Creole families in any decent-sized town are of all shades. And this is largely because lighter-skinned men and lighter-skinned women would not marry each other. From the late 1980s, let's say 1989 on, you couldn't get them to do it. They wouldn't chase each other. Even I myself was never with a light-skinned woman until I married on the African continent. And before that, I was thinking maybe I wouldn't be able to perform physically because I'd never been with a light-skinned woman before, and I wasn't trained for it, you could say. I didn't acclimate myself to it. I held hands with and kissed one light-skinned woman in my whole life before I became Muslim. That's it. Now, in today's time, pretty much ever since like 1989, like I said, we don't pursue each other, and that may never happen again. To this day, I just don't see it happen. I saw it once with one of my friends, D. He married a light-skinned woman she was from New Orleans, actually, and she just came home one day and said, "I'm just not happy." Now, there was nothing soft about this dude, nothing at all. She just wasn't happy. We know what that is. She found someone else, and definitely he was darker. Now, They split peacefully. There was nothing hostile about it. He's still nice to her brothers and they get along. But I don't even know how they wound up together, to be honest. Usually a light-skinned black woman will tell you straight up that she's not into light-skinned guys. And guess what? This is how lighter-skinned black men learn to prefer only darker or non-black women. So when you cry about colorism, and it is a problem, it does exist, but when you cry about it with respect to dating and mating, actually paler men paler men don't approach lighter-skinned women in many cases. I take that back. A cousin of mine, but he's older anyway. A cousin of mine did in fact marry a lighter skinned woman. That's almost all he's ever been serious with for a long stretch of time. He's dated medium, light skin. He married a light skinned woman, but I look at their age group, they're well above mine, and they came up at a time when that was normal. But see, men learn over time to not want who doesn't want them. And if you light skinned guy in the South, you quickly learn if they do want you, they would never admit it. So this is the mechanism by which light-skinned families can't even stay light-skinned as a whole anymore. 60 years ago, this may have been more possible, but even then, a common occurrence was for black men from those families to discard this advice from mothers and not even hear this from their fathers. I know because I asked people and they confirmed it for me. Another misconception is that educated black men pursue white women. The truth is they don't have to. Educated black men get pursued by white women. I never had this happen to me because I'm not black enough. But I know educated black men who were pursued by white women, and outside of the South, they were more open and brazen when they did it. They got chased down by white women. Not necessarily other women of color or by black women, but by white women. Now, an educated chocolate brother might get pursued by light-skinned black women. But outside of that, no, pretty much white women did the pursuing. And ironically, though, most black men I know dated or married black women, even though they were pursued by white women. Then Latina, non-black women, then Asian, and the smallest number were actually with white women. So black men actually jumped over the white women that pursued them the most to still be with other melanated women that pursued them a little bit less. Another one is a misconception that light-skinned black families owned slaves and lived on plantations before the Civil War just like white folks. That wasn't normal either. Now, in New Orleans, there's a museum dedicated to free people of color, but there's little mention in historical records of them owning any large numbers of slaves per capita or even any large estates. So, and I've met the owner of the museum. She didn't make mention of that. She gives guided tours. I got one of them, and she didn't make mention of any large numbers owning large numbers of slaves. She made mention of a few that owned large numbers of slaves. They were rare, and they had to be careful because white folks were jealous. Black slave owners usually throughout the South owned single-digit numbers of slaves. Usually they were families because black slave owners had an easier time buying their own wives from the white masters than freeing them, because white folks were not resistant to selling black folks to other black folks who could pay the price. They were resistant to freeing them, and most southern states eventually enacted laws that did not allow black free owners to free slaves. They just couldn't do it. You can buy them, but you couldn't free them. It wasn't legal. So black slave owners were often barred from freeing whoever they owned. So whites would rather sell a slave to a free husband than to free her for any amount of money. And this would lead to more blacks they feared would agitate the captive population. So many times a black slave owner had his family legally owned as slaves, but they were his family, and if they weren't already free. And remember this too, a free black person of any complexion could not afford to flaunt wealth by buying large numbers of slaves unless the whites trusted her or him to be harsh on them. Now this happened in South Carolina. A black man became free, he bought a bunch of slaves and he would break them for other masters, but he specialized in being harsh on them and breaking them. There isn't even anecdotal evidence from back then of lighter-skinned black folks being more likely to be free, let alone own slaves, let alone be harsher on them. This was not even a stereotype back then during slavery. The stereotype developed later on, in the 1900s. And these are just some examples of misconceptions we have about colorism. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of a truth about colorism that we got to deal with right now. Right now, we have to deal with the international form of colorism. Black men, sometimes this applies to you, sometimes it doesn't. And when I say colorism, I pretty much just mean people's preference for lighter skin based on it being lighter and closer to white. You don't really have to face this a whole lot. As much. There'll be individual preferences, but they are individual preferences. There will be women that prefer darker men in these other countries and women that prefer lighter men in these other countries when they prefer still black men. Sisters don't have the same thing. Black women, the men that prefer you are black men, and most black men do prefer you. This is a good thing for you. So, you're not being abandoned because you are black, because your noses are wide, because of your melanin content, your lips, or your 4C hair. You're being abandoned because of attitude issues and weight, things that are under your control. These brothers can bounce, they're wanted. You bounce, you may be wanted professionally. You're usually not wanted romantically by these men, according to what they're telling me. Now, there are men who say you've got the best bodies, and that matters to them, but many of them still would not want to commit. If they can get it, they can get the milk free, they'll do that, but they ain't gonna buy the cow. When they would buy the cow, as long as the cow's white. Not to call you cows, but you understand what I mean. This is common. And many times these people think that their colorism is actually normal. They don't think that there's anything wrong with their colorism. So they're not going to let you try to correct them or tell them about how they've been brainwashed. I've done it. I've told them you're brainwashed. You watch the TV, you believe them damn white folks, you think they're normal, and I'm telling you, you're sick because of it. I've had these conversations with them. It takes a lot to even get them to listen, especially when you're dealing with the Arab Bedouin. Especially. And I'm going to have to do another recording about them one day. But the idea that colorism is only, I'm not going to say affected. It's right that colorism is affected by white supremacy. But the idea that colorism actually started with white people, that's false. No. It was either these Arabs, the Indians, or the Persians. And I think it was the Persians that may have started, because they started white supremacy, actually. And that is the major misconception behind all of this that we need to know about. White supremacy, color prejudice actually did not get started with Europeans, from what we can understand. The evidence is that it was there among Persians. Oldest written records probably come from the Indians, but this was after they were conquered by Persians, and they became the Indo-Aryans. Maybe that's where the Arabs got it from, because the Arabs at one time were black. I mean, just unmistakably just as black as the Abyssinians. So I find it hard to believe that the Arabs got this from themselves, or that they began it. But I've looked into this because I've been pro-black my whole life, and I want to know where this started from, and I'm going to do what I can to fight it. But brothers, don't tell sisters that I'm doing what I can to fight this colorism thing abroad. Don't tell them that. Because I'm doing it for the race. I'm not doing it just for black women. I'm doing it simply because it's wrong. Because the colorism's wrong. Because it's not okay for them to call it a personal preference when all of them have the same preference that favors the oppressor over the oppressed. That's not okay. And I'm not going to act like it is. But don't tell sisters I'm doing this, because I'm not doing this to validate them. I'm doing it because this is something that is unfair even to them. And I'm going to be fair. I'm not going to let even hatred of a people make me swerve from justice. So I'm definitely not going to let just being disappointed and disgusted by somebody make me treat them unfair, or allow me to let someone else to treat them unfair. This ain't something that sisters earn. They didn't provoke it. This happened before we even were taken from Africa, to be honest. However, sisters do need to know that their best chance is not going, even if they don't want us no more, their best chance is not going to be with them white dude, and it ain't going to be with any of these semi-Negroes around here in my region of the world now that call themselves white. They don't stand a chance in that case. They're not going to be treated as equals when it comes to romance and marriage. End of story. I wish they were, but they're not. It ain't going to happen. And it doesn't even have to necessarily be about any hatred. They're just not going to get that because, frankly, they're not going to get that here because, simply put, everybody's been, the TV's helped, but there's been this preference for the light-skinned women even from before in certain parts of the world. Maybe not everywhere, but certain parts of the world. I wish it wasn't the case. I hope that one day it's not the case. In the meantime, I hope that what I say is a benefit until the day that it is no longer the case. This is the blackest man on social media signing black out again. Assalamu alaikum and black male power just because they don't like it.